All right, thanks for everyone who's joining us now. We have a few announcements at the top here. First, we are recording this session and it will be available in Whova, our conference app, within 2 weeks after the Congress ends. If you'd like to ask our speakers a question during this session, please use the Q&A area in Whova to the right of your screen. The chat window is where you can engage with other attendees. And we kindly ask that you keep your microphones and cameras off during the presentations, but then follow the presenter's lead on when to engage with cameras and microphones on during the Q&A. It looks like we're getting ready to get started, so I'm going to hand it over to our first speaker. Please welcome Stacy Drury. Stacy?
Hello, everyone. Can we see my screen now?
Not quite yet, but we'll get there in a minute.
Okay.
There we go. There we go.
All right. Thanks for having me today. I am Stacy Drury. I'm with the Pacific Southwest Research Station, and I've been working on this project for about 4 years. So I'm really excited to talk to you today. I will first want to mention my colleagues, Lucas Harris, who has done most of the heavy lifting on this project, and then Alan Taylor and my co-worker at PSW, John Benoit, for helping out with some of the recent stuff we're doing. There we go. So most of you are aware of the California fire problem. We've been having increasingly larger and more severe and more frequent big fires. Virtually every year we set a new record in terms of fire size, and the severity within those large scale fires is becoming more connected and larger in many cases. So we're seeing in those areas of high severity a type conversion from closed canopy conifers to shrubs, sometimes grasses. And what's becoming increasingly important, especially near where I live here, just along the Russian River, is fires are moving from the wildland areas through the woody and into urban areas and burning infrastructure. This project in itself came out of a hallway discussion I had with a FMO on the Shasta Trinity a few years ago, where I asked, what's the biggest thing, the issue that he has? And he was like, well, we're trying to apply managed wildfire for multiple objectives on these landscapes, but we don't know when, where, and how much tree mortality we should expect. And this was all within the umbrella of the cohesive strategy. So in the next few minutes, I'm going to give you a real basic overview of our Northern California fire severity probability mapping project, talk about the status where we've got the areas mapped at this point, what products are available, and some future goals. And once again, just to restate the objectives, we're looking at identifying these drivers of fire severity in Northern California, and then we've expanded to the Sierras with the idea of using these drivers to predict fire severity. So producing maps that can allow managers to have an idea of what the future fire severity will be in these areas. And we want to support management decisions. So where in the landscape can you apply prescribed fire? Where might managing an unplanned ignition for ecological benefit or multiple objectives be worthwhile, with this main goal of creating fire resilient ecosystems and reducing the amount of full fire suppression on the landscape. So when can we not so much let these fires, but when can we manage these fires in a way that burns under ecological beneficial conditions and promotes safety of firefighters and the public? So I'm real happy when I got a little bit of a sneak peek at what the next speakers are going to talk about. And so I'm happy I didn't try to go into some specifics on some of these tools like the MTBS. But what we are using for producing our maps is the random forest machine learning software and the techniques associated with that. We've run that across basically all of Northern California, you can see in this map, and into the Sierra Mountain Range here. We're looking to expand down into Southern California, but that hasn't been done at this time. Basic inputs to the model is our satellite-based NDVR for vegetation, land fire for vegetation type. We're inputting weather and climate using the 4-kilometer GridMet and PRISM data sets. Topography is basic topographic metrics from DEMs, and then some calculated topographic position type indices. We're using fire and land management history from the monitoring trends and burn severity, which will be described in detail later. The FRAP fire history map for where fire polygons are in the landscape. And then the fuels activity tracking system is one of our sources of fuels treatments across the landscape. And we're heavily dependent on the historic fire severity from MTBS using RD-MBR differencing and the composite burn indices. We're producing these models using by region and watershed. And you'll see in a slide that comes up why we're going with region. But the main idea here is that for each one of these 6 regions we've identified, we use a watershed basis to then map and predicted fire severity given current conditions and a set of 5 weather scenarios for every 30-meter pixel across the landscape. And so a key point is we're producing an MTBS-like product. So if the fire burned, what kind of fire severity map would MTBS produce? And how would it map the individual pixels on the landscape? We're not focused on trying to produce high fire severity exclusively, but looking at the range of fire severities, and particularly interested in low fire severity because we want to identify areas where you can do management, particularly applying landscape scale prescribed fire and managing unplanned ignitions. And we produce, so for each region, we produce 2 models, a non-reburn model, so areas that have not burned since 1984. They could have not burned for over 100 years, but the baseline is 1984 because post-1984, we have historic fire severity. And then the reburn model, which includes all fires that have burned since 1984 and have fire severity data. And the important drivers of fire are different for these 2 areas, the reburn and the non-reburn. And this is the Klamath model. They all differ a little bit, and I'll show a quick graph later. But the Klamath model, basically biomass is represented by the NDVI satellite-derived indices, and weather and climate variables were most important for the Klamath. Way down here, I don't know, it's about 10, elevation comes in. So topography isn't that important for this model, but weather, biomass are. When you switch over to the areas that have been burned since 1984, the biggest driver is how did the fire burn in the last fire? So if it burned under low severity, then it tends to burn under low severity in subsequent fires. If it burned under high severity, the same thing, it tends to burn at high severity again. And we're working out some of the ideas, but there's, vegetation change, there's fuels produced by the previous fire. There's a lot of things going on into that. And then biomass also plays a role, but everything gets pretty much swamped by the historic fire severity. And this is kind of to give an idea of why we went with individual region-based kind of approach for producing these maps because the drivers change by region, and we spent a little time working this out. But you can see that some things are constant. Elevation is in every model, although some of them it's not as strong as in others. NDVI, so biomass or vegetation, is in every model, sometimes stronger, sometimes not. And then the energy release component, kind of a measure of fuel readiness to burn, is in every model. But other than that, there things vary. Like the Northern Sierra, none of the topography comes in, but some of the things, like some of the weather comes in at different places. Whereas we noticed weather was a heavy driver in the Klamath, weather's a heavy driver in the non-reburn in the North Coast. So there's some variability across this landscape, and we took advantage of that. And then with the reburn model, we see the same thing, that there's some consistency, except that in the Northeast, the historic fire severity is not a big role player in driving fire severity prediction, but weather is, whereas weather's not as important for most of the other models. So kind of looking at this and saying, is this a vegetation type driven? Was it grasslands or shrublands more consistent in Northeast? There's a lot of pinyon pine up there. So just kind of looking at how these different things are. So there's a lot of stuff for us still to investigate and look a little bit harder. These maps, this version was only produced in September, so we're working through a number of different things to understand it a little better, but I'm really excited about where we're going. All right, so how accurate are we? I put up here 2 measures of model accuracy coming from the model itself. One is what they call the out of bag, which uses all the fires in the system, doesn't pull anything out, so there's no independent variables. And we're doing pretty good for accuracy. So basically, if we predict low with the non-reburn model in the Klamath, 61% of the time we're right, but only 14% of the time do we say it's going to be low and it's high. So that's good, that's promising. We want to improve this, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but we are looking at this moving forward in terms of pretty confident that we're doing a fairly good job with those estimates. But when we go to an independent test set, the low severity, we're still good at that, but we're not doing so well with the high severity. 27% of the time we accurately predicted high severity. So we predicted it, and that's what was on the landscape. In both cases, both the non-reburn and the reburn model, we have a tendency to have low or moderate fire severity when we predict high. And the only real good thing about that is that this is a conservative estimate. I'd rather predict high and have it burn at lower severity than predict low and have a tendency to burn at higher severity. And we're remembering this is a model and it should be used at a pretty much landscape scale. So this is kind of wrapping it up. We've got a lot of different tools out there right now we can use to compare and look at how well our model is doing based on observations. This is the 2020 red salmon fire. We looked at ravage first, the rapid assessment. Then we looked at the monitoring trends in burn severity done 1 year later that gets at that more long-term mortality. And then we have a version 1 of our model and a version 2 of our model to compare with those. And we're seeing that in the most part, we're doing okay with our version model, version 2 model, the MTBS related, and the MTBS data that we have and we calculated. But we're missing some of those high fire severity burn areas. Like this area burned on the 7th and the 8th of September. And so when I look specifically at that, we have observed it mostly burned at high and then some at moderate, but burned right through the riparian zones and came out very high. When we're modeling it, we see on the ridge tops, we have a good agreement with our model in the ridge tops, but we predicted the riparian zones to burn at low severity. And so I'm trying to look right now at tying our burn area, so time that the area burned, to the weather at that time. This is wind rose from 12 to 6 p.m. The winds at that time were basically out of the southwest and roughly 0 to 10 miles an hour. And I've seen crown fire at 5 miles an hour pretty frequently. So we have the potential for crown fire in these areas, but we don't see the big winds that I might have expected in some other regions. When we then take and move that and look at the RH values, 30 is a pretty low RH, they start looking at watch out situations around 30 in the Klamath Mountains. And so from midnight to 11, we see this pattern of low RHs, and then it drops down to seriously low dry conditions around 3, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And we see the same trend with the temperature being high. So we're wondering if our 99th percentile value that we're seeing here is actually capturing these real extreme events. And so those are one of the things we're going to be working on. We have 3 recent publications that you can find if you Google me or go to these websites. Our fire severity potential maps are available in the Sierras in Northern California. I've been sending them out to land managers. We're currently doing evaluations on the 2020 red salmon, August, and the glass fire, plus the 2021 antelope and tamarack fires. And we're really looking at refining these drivers and improving our current maps. We're going to include GOES satellites, Ravage, and increased use of Google Earth engines, so we can produce these on an annual basis. So when 2022 fire season comes around, for example, we can then go to we can have all of the 2021 fires mapped. We're not at that point yet, with the ultimate goal of producing a near real-time fire severity prediction system, so we can estimate these fire severity potentials based on where the fire is likely to go using forecasted weather. People can start making decisions on what kind of management strategy could be implemented best. And so thanks for your time. Hopefully not too far outside of my time range. And once again, if you want to talk any more about this, I'd be glad to talk your ear off about what we're learning about fire severity modeling and prediction.
Thank you, Stacy. Does anyone have any questions? You can either drop it in the chat in Whova or Q&A, or you can simply just turn on your microphone here and ask Stacy a question.
And I don't have Whova open, so.
No, I got you. I got you covered over there. So if something comes through, I'll see it.
I think the Zoom chat may be disabled.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, Stacy, this is Alex. I had a quick question. In your random forest model, the climatic variables you used, what kind of temporal aggregation were you using for those?
We were using annual.
Okay. Have you considered possibly trying to use something like fire progression from MODIS to tie that to like daily fire weather predictions?
Right. We are, and we are using the GeoMac, but so that is daily. But you know, we're basing it. I guess I'm wrong there. We're using grid map and we're using daily weather. So we're tying 24-hour weather to 24-hour fire progression using GeoMac rather than MODIS. And so those are the fire progressions developed by GIS analysts on the landscape, or that are actually on the fire, or now they're remote. But anyway, what I've been working on is I'd like to get it down to like, okay, did this burn in late afternoon or early morning? I think a lot of times we're using 24-hour weather, 24-hour fire progression, and we don't know if the fire actually burned at the hot part of the day or at the low part of the say, you know, after midnight, you know, and we also aren't doing a great job on pulling in fire management operations on some of these fires. They did a lot of backfiring and things in front of the fire, which are coming out at low severity when I know where they are, but where we tend to be mapping them at high severity from time to time. So really, narrowing out that window, narrowing it down to burn severity versus, fire severity, time when the area burned, and the weather at that time is going to be crucial to our next improvement.
Thank you so much, Stacy. The time is up, so appreciate your talk here. Next up, we have Seth Bogle. Seth?
Hi, yes, I'm gonna be showing you, let's see, let me start sharing my screen here. Right. And while I'm sharing my screen, I'm actually gonna turn my video off. And then I'll turn it back on for question time. So yes, my name's Seth Bogle. I work with the Monitoring Trends and Burn Severity program, MTBS. I'm a contractor with the USDA Forest Service at the Geospatial Technology and Application Center. And today I'm going to be talking to you about the MTBS Data Explorer, which is a new tool that we've been developing and released earlier this year. So before I get into talking about the actual Data Explorer, I want to first just give a brief overview of what MTBS is for anyone who may not be aware. It's a very high level overview, but just to let you all know, so MTBS is a program that's designed to assess the frequency, extent, and magnitude in both size and severity of large wildland fires, which include both wildfire and prescribed fire within the continental United States, Alaska, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico. This program has been mapping fires that occurred from 1984 to the present. And what that does is it corresponds to the Landsat record of thematic mapper, enhanced thematic mapper, and OLI. In the past few years, we have started using Sentinel-2 data to address fires where suitable Landsat data is not available. So our mapping criteria, excuse me, what we call large fires is anything greater than 1,000 acres in the west or greater than 500 acres in the east. And these fire records come from official systems of record. That's where we get this information from, and that's what we're using to determine whether we make these assessments or not. One thing to note that every fire isn't necessarily mapped. If we don't have clear post fire imagery, then that's not necessarily mapped. But right now, what you're looking at is the composite of all the MTBS burn severities from 1984 to 2019. And currently through 2019, we have approximately over 28,500 fires that we've mapped, which accounts for nearly 195 million acres. So some of the advantages of MTBS is that it's consistently derived. Unlike other fire disturbance data sets, MTBS maps all fires using remote sensing data and science sanctioned methods. So sometimes fire occurrence data, especially some of the older stuff, is temporally extensive, but doesn't necessarily give us the extent or fire effects information for individual incidents. And unlike other fire disturbance data sets, MTBS characterizes fire effects that are detectable, such as changes to above ground biomass. One thing about MTBS that's really nice is it's spatially comprehensive. It's nationwide coverage from all lands. And even though MTBS only maps about 5% of the fires that occur annually, that 5% accounts for nearly 95% of the burned area each year. And it is quite temporally comprehensive. It covers a historically significant period, which allows for studies in variability and trend analysis. The data is actually not mapped aggregate. So each individual fire is mapped individually, and then the data products are aggregated together. So if you've ever seen anything like regional mosaics and that sort of thing, each of those actually come from individual mappings. Each fire is treated as a different mapping. Now that I'm done with that overview, I'm going to start talking a little bit about the Data Explorer and the tools we've been developing. So what you see here is just a screenshot of the MTBS Data Explorer. And just to kind of give a background of why we took this on. So historically, MTBS data was published with some fire level and aggregated statistical summaries, typically in like a CSV form. They were done using various overlays with various geospatial strata, such as land cover, administrative ownerships, watersheds, and that sort of thing. It's to kind of help support this quantitative summary and analysis needs that certain people have. However, the problems with this was that it took a lot of effort to do this on each individual fire as the fires were being mapped. And it also, almost immediately after this data was produced, it would go, it would be obsolete for whatever reason, whether it be, a change in a geopolitical boundary, a change in a forest boundary, or something like that. So this data was static, and it wouldn't allow users to manipulate and change and use their own area of aggregation. So what we decided to do was build this basically within a GEE-based application. And so in addition to having the MTBS data there, it utilizes other GEE data assets that are available online. And what it allows us to do is on the fly visualize, summarize, trend analysis, and it's totally dynamic and customizable. Here you can see the link to where the Data Explorer lives. It is on mtbs.gov, which is the main website for MTBS. And if you don't have to necessarily write this URL down, because you can access it from the top bar on mtbs.gov under Tools. There's a top tab that says Tools, and the first one down is Data Explorer, and you can get there. Just really briefly, because this is a short talk today, and there's a lot of things I'm going to be skimming over, that we do have planned for a more comprehensive webinar in early 2022. So if you would be interested in that, you can either email me directly, or you can also email the MTBS help desk at this email address here. That contact is also available at mtbs.gov. Okay. So next thing I want to show is just the kind of the first splash screen when you get into the MTBS Data Explorer. There is the option immediately when you go in there to run a walkthrough, which is really nice. And I would encourage people at your first, visit to the site to run that. What's nice about it is it's not just a bunch of, it is a bunch of text, but it's not just a bunch of text that you're running through this walkthrough. There's several slides, and the slides are interactive with the tabs on the left-hand side of the viewer. So as you get to a certain step within the walkthrough, it'll actually show you in the tab, open that tab, and so on and so forth, and really kind of guide you through. So it's not just a tutorial. It actually is a walkthrough of the entire site. So what I'm going to do next is just kind of go through some of these tabs on the left-hand side here. So the first thing we can see here under the parameters tab is the option to select what geographical area we're interested in visualizing and doing our analysis, as well as a date range. And this date range can be collapsed to 5-year increments. You can look at the whole data record, or you can collapse it down to a single year if that's what you're most interested in. So next we're looking at the MTBS data tab, and what this is actually where all the MTBS data is loaded in. So we have the perimeters there, we have the severity layers there, and then we have some information that's kind of calculated nationally on the fly, and that's these kind of areas under the perimeters, such as the burn count, the burn year. And also there's the option to do a burn severity time lapse, so you can actually watch the burn severity progress in a certain area if that's something you're interested in doing. And additionally, these layers can be adjusted. These sliders next to them will allow you to adjust the transparency so you can see other layers underneath, if that's helpful to you. So the next tab we're looking at is the reference data. So this is really helpful if you want some very high resolution imagery from, say, NAPE data records. Also what it provides, in addition to the time lapse that I was showing you just a moment ago with the MTBS data, is you can look at NLCD time lapse as well, and it'll go through the various NLCD layers, National Land Cover Database 2001, 4, et cetera, et cetera. Next, this is kind of really where the meat of this tool lies, is in this tools tab. So there's various, at the top is just measuring tools. Now these are just typical measuring tools like you would find on Google Maps or something like that, or Google Earth, just measuring distances, measuring areas, and you can have different units. You can adjust the units on the fly as you're using that. And then as far as looking at the data itself, there's a couple ways you can do this. You can look at it individually from each pixel, or you can look at it across an entire area. The pixel tool allows you to take a single point at the 30-meter resolution that MTBS data is provided, click on that pixel, and it'll drill down through there and show, if there was various severities at different years and that sort of thing. And then the area tool actually allows you to do this more widespread analysis for, a whole region of some sort. And I'm going to show a few of those in just a moment. Before I do that though, one thing I wanted to bring up too is that as you're going through this, in addition to the tutorial and the walkthrough I was talking about at the beginning, something else that's very helpful about this tool is that you can, or it has pop-ups as you hover over different things, and it'll give you hints as far as what is this particular tool doing? How do I use this? Which is a nice little feature as well. Okay, now looking at some of the analysis. Not sure what happened there. Okay, so let's look at this one. Okay, for this particular area, what we're looking at is burn severity summary by year for a single administrative unit. And what we're looking at is we're actually looking at the Upper Lake Ranger District on the Mendocino. Now this layer has already been added in to the Data Explorer, which allows you to kind of just select that particular unit area and then get kind of a fire history. You can see here, we can look at fires that occurred in 87, 88, 96, so on and so forth for that area. And I'm going to show something else in the next slide that's not really displayed here, but it's in addition to just seeing it charted like this, you can hover over these different locations, like these different severities at these different years, and get the count for how many acres was that of high severity in, say, 2018. All this information can also be downloaded as a PNG visualization of like what you see here, or you can also download it in a CSV format if you want to run your analysis separately, like in a statistical program such as R or something like that. Next, this is just doing a different type of analysis where we're looking at aggregating by land cover. So this is taking the NLCD for 2016. We've selected, instead of a district, we've selected a fire perimeter, the 2018 ranch fire, and we've done the analysis to see how much of each type of vegetation was burned and at what severity. And this does demonstrate what I was talking about before, where you can touch a portion of this graph and see exactly how many acres of that area is burned. One thing just to kind of visualize a few other features here is the, you can look at burn severity just in the burned area boundaries. You can turn that off, look at just year of burn, and there's, you have a scale, basically a continuous scale from the beginning of the data record to the end of the data record. And then also there's a frequency of burn and reburn. So in this case, what we're looking at is we're looking at areas in blue where it was one fire, only one fire. And then you can see as the colors progress more towards red, there's more occurrence of burn and reburn. And that's on an by pixel basis. Okay, I've got just a couple more minutes and I'm pretty much done with talking about the Data Explorer, but I did want to kind of use this forum to tell everybody about one other thing that's going on within MTBS, kind of a side project. Now, this is not something that's replacing any of the individual websites for things such as MTBS, Bear, and Ravage, which are various products. And I know Stacy mentioned those just a moment ago. But one thing we've been working on in conjunction with USGS is this burn severity portal. And what it is it's a just this interagency clearinghouse of all the data that we have available from both the Forest Service and the Department of the Interior post-fire mapping programs. And right now we're still in the process of loading everything in, but at the current time we have about 36,000 fire mapping records in there, or data products, and more than 6,000 CBI field-based severity assessment records as well, all located here at burnseverity.cr.usgs.gov. So that's something that's really exciting, and that's it for me. I will stop sharing and turn my camera on.
Thank you, Seth. If anyone has a question for Seth, please feel free and unmute yourself, or it looks like we have one in the Q&A in Whova. I'm just going to read it out for you. From Jen Stevens. Great tool. Is there a preferred browser for the Data Explorer? I've played around with it a few times previously, and it seemed to be slow to load even within a relatively restricted area of interest.
So Chrome is probably the best tool to use, or the best browser to use for this. I believe it works pretty well in Firefox as well. The thing about the loading, that really is dependent, and I understand that, and that's one of the reasons why I did static display with these slides today and not try to do a live demonstration, because it really does depend on the load on Google servers, on how quick it loads. So
that makes sense. Anyone else have a question? We've got a couple minutes here.
Hi, Seth. This is Alex. This is a super cool tool. I'm wondering, I've been using Earth Engine quite a bit for my own work recently, and wondering if there are plans to get the whole MTBS data record as like a general Earth Engine asset for usage at some point in the near future. And also about, this is all, looks like it's the categorical version of the burn severity data. Will there be plans to add the continuous burn severity as well?
So currently, as far as to answer your first question, yes, there are plans. Currently, these assets live in Google Cloud Platform. They are publicly available if you have the path to them. But to answer your second question, as far as it being a publicly accessible data set, yes, that is very near in the future. In fact, I have a meeting with someone next week because we're going through the forms and submitting that data as an official Google asset. On your second question, as far as I'm trying to, you're talking about, so are you asking about the continuous data such as loading in the DNBRs and RDNBR data into Google as well?
Right, like the uncategorical versions of the burn severity data sets, yeah.
Gotcha. At this time, we don't have any plans for that. And really the main reason for that is it's difficult. We've talked about it, but we're afraid of how it might be potentially not necessarily misused, but not correctly understood. So that's why we're kind of refraining from using that data or loading that data into Google at this point.
There's another question for you in Whova. Any chance to create a cell phone tool or app?
We haven't really discussed that, but I'm interested to bring that forward, and I will see what we can do as far as creating. Yeah, I'll just bring it to the group. Absolutely.
Great. And it looks like Mike has a question. You have your hand raised, feel free.
Yeah, hey Seth.
Hey.
Hey, so I was wondering, is there any effort or has there been any thought into being able to upload your own calibrations for thresholding? Basically, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different thresholding curves for different landscapes and different fuel types. As new work gets done, is there any way that maybe there could be a tool where people could import their own thresholds for the map?
Yeah, I get what you're saying. I'm kind of wondering how difficult that would be, as far as, because each one is based on a different DNVR pairing, if that would be a little difficult to, to make a blanket change like that. Something else we have been working on are some other additional GEE tools, just to kind of mimic MTBS. Just burn severity product generator is what we call them. And if you're interested in that, I'd be happy to set up a time with you at another time and talk about that and show you kind of what we've got going on that side. It's totally unrelated to this.
Okay, that sounds neat. Thanks.
Well, on that note, thank you so much, Seth. We really appreciate your presentation. We're going to actually bring Mike up to the stage. Mike Gallagher, please feel free and turn on your camera. Welcome.
Hey there. I don't know about you. I'm parasailing right now in Destin Beach.
Looks fantastic. Wish I was there.
Me too. All right, let me just share this. Right. Can you see it?
It's loading. Just a minute. Yep, I see it.
All right. Sorry, I've got some. Let's see if I can minimize this window here. No. All right, hang on.
Sure, no problem.
All right. So my name is Mike Gallagher, and I'm a research ecologist with the U.S. Forest Service Northern Research Station. I'm located in the New Jersey Pine Barrens at the Silas Little Experimental Forest. And I'm going to talk to you today about a recent study that my partners and I did, testing a new method of plot level burn severity monitoring with a terrestrial laser scanner. So first, there's a lot of fire on our landscapes across the country. We've been talking about that this whole meeting, both in terms of wildfire and prescribed fire. Nationally, I think we burn about 6 million hectares a year, with about 2/3 of that being prescribed fire, actually, and quite a bit of that is in the east. So historically, we've quantified burned area as just burned area. This is a map of some burns that happened a few years ago down the road from my experimental forest. And this is really nice, but it doesn't really say much about the heterogeneity, right? So we've been talking about monitoring burn severity. And if we, whoops, here we go. As you can see, there's a lot of heterogeneity in these burns. So one way we summarize that is with reflectance. We talked about that a little bit in these other presentations. And basically, green and brown and charred foliage have different reflectance patterns that are reflected in tools like MTBS. We have,
Hey, Mike, real quick, I just want to interrupt for just 1 second. I want to make sure that your screen is being viewed the whole way. I only see a couple of photos in one chart. Is that what we're seeing?
There's a, it says evaluating change at the top, and there's a couple pictures of a pine needles and some shrubs.
Yep, I think that there's some stuff on the right side possibly that is being cut off. Maybe not. I keep going. We'll keep going.
Okay.
I'll let you know. You're good.
Okay, thanks. So basically, just getting into this, this is basically how remote sensing burn severity works. And so now you should be seeing a burn severity map, and that's similar to how MTBS works. And the assumption is that this means something proportional to information on the ground. So to calibrate satellite derived burn severity, which was kind of what I was asking about in my last question to Seth, to calibrate something meaningful, we can go out in the field and look at these different characteristics of how the forest changes on the ground. On the left here, we might have an area that's more lower severity, and on the right here we've got an area that's a higher severity. But what does that mean in terms of three-dimensional change in structure and fire effects on the ground? So we can go out with this field sheet and use the composite burn index, which is the common way of evaluating burn severity. See these different images here are changes in how the forest looks. CBI process evaluates change in different strata, usually using visual cues like how brown or how green or how much soil is exposed in the forest. So although CBI is the gold standard, there's some challenges with it. First, I think it's safe to say that the original purpose was to assess fire severities in western fires, which occur during the growing season when you've got a lot of green vegetation available. But more than half the fire in the country occurs in the east as prescribed fire, and much of that is during the dormant season when there's a mix of coniferous and deciduous forests, and green leaves are largely absent. Another challenge is that strong patterns in the vertical distribution of vegetation are common and influence some bias in CBI calculations, while fire effects are unevenly sampled across forest strata. And so this, I don't know if this figure is easy to interpret, but basically you're seeing more fire effects where you've got more continuum of cover. So at least in the east, we have a lot of cover at the bottom of the forest, and maybe less at the top of the forest where the canopy is a little more open. Also, that affects the evaluation criteria of CBI, really restricts the resolution of change that you can evaluate in the understory, while you get a lot more resolution in the overstory. Another challenge is observer bias. Different observers see things very differently. This is just a picture of my colleague Nick and I out in the fire that we were doing some CBI plots in, and this has been a challenge of CBI for a while. Getting back to the satellite imagery part too, it really works great unless you have a lot of clouds. I did a quick analysis, and about 2/3 of the imagery over this fire that I keep showing you in the Pine Barrens, 2/3 of the imagery in the 5 years after that had clouds obscuring the data. So one solution is plot level to this challenge of how do we evaluate burn severity in the field is plot level terrestrial laser scanning, which uses a laser and camera to capture the structure and color characteristics that an observer sees. This can do it faster with richer output data and is very consistent because it's basically just physics. In our work, we use this terrestrial laser scanner, the Leica BLK 360, which is a lightweight, portable, easy to use, push of button, relatively inexpensive unit. When I say relatively inexpensive, it's about $30,000 with software, but compared to the cost of a technician for a year, that's not too bad in my opinion. So the BLK scans reflect three-dimensional forest structure data, including highly detailed forest understory data. And this is a major improvement over airborne laser scanning, which often poorly accounts for vegetation below the canopy. The scanner also collects RGB data with a camera while scanning. And the scans take about 4 minutes, so it's pretty quick. And if you're working hard in a single scan, in a single stand, where you don't have to drive from site to site, you can knock out about 40 to 50 scans in a single day. That's 40 or 50 different plots with one user. So our study was pretty simple. We set out to answer 3 questions. First, can data collected with the BLK 360 sufficiently predict burn severity? Can machine learning improve predictions over traditional linear regression? And does combining structure and RGB data from that camera improve those predictions? So to answer these questions, we went to a unit in the Pine Barrens that was scheduled to be burned and established 43 plots. Each plot had a 10-meter radius and was scanned before and after burning. CBI data were collected post-burn as well as afterwards. And I'm sorry, CBI data were collected after the fire. The forest was pitch pine dominated, but it was split interestingly between typical statured pines and we have these genetically stunted pitch pines as well. So that provided a good contrast in forest structure with a consistent understory of dormant ericaceous and shrub form oaks. The site hadn't burned in the last 80 years, so there's no confounding factor of previous burns available. So for each plot, our data collection yielded 23 CBI variables and a total of 70 TLS variables and 10 RGB variables. And this is just kind of what they looked like. Basically, we summarize these into 4 forest strata. CBI typically uses 5 forest strata, 2 of which are canopy trees, dominant and subdominant trees. We combine them for this study. And these are our different thresholds for where those different forest strata were. But basically, the substrates, the herbs, the low shrubs, tall shrubs, and trees. Then we use the BOK to predict CBI results. We use 2 machine learning algorithms, random forests and support machine vectors, in addition to multiple linear regression. And we did that to predict CBI. So we used all the data from the TLS to predict CBI in each strata and then total CBI for the plot. Since we had a small number of plots, 43, we used a K-fold approach in our analysis, which worked well. We repeated this using all the variables, but we also did it using just post-burn scan data and just the laser data and just the RGB data to look at how the different data performed in these predictions. So overall, machine learning, overall, the BOK did a really good job of predicting burn severity. We can see from these figures that machine learning algorithms did a better job of predicting CBI than linear regression. And I'm just going to say right now that I am not at all a machine learning expert. Aaron Maxwell at WVU is a friend of ours and a colleague who was working on this project, and he's the machine learning guru in our team. But generally, CBI for the tree strata and total plot CBI were best predicted, while the substrate and herbaceous material were predicted worse. So basically, the elevated or the higher up strata in the canopy were predicted best. And this is likely because the canopy is the largest layer with the greatest possible range of change to be detected. And again, I'll just flash back to this slide from before. The canopy, we're looking at this in terms of CBI, we're looking at things like how green and how brown and how high is the char height. There's more variables there that can change, whereas on the ground, we're looking at how much leaf litter got consumed and is there soil exposure. And it doesn't really change a whole lot in our environment, so that doesn't really have a whole lot of resolution that it contributes to a CBI estimate. So we also, and also at the surface level, there's no leaves at that time of year to really change. So that can be, that's an observation that we can't make. We also note that the RGB data, which is the yellow bars, poorly predicted burn severity alone and provide only minimal improvement in predictions when it was incorporated with TLS data, which is shown in the green bars. That's the incorporation of everything. We also note that including difference pre and post TLS data didn't provide a huge difference in results compared to using only post-burn data. So this work is described in full detail in our recent paper in remote sensing and highlights the potential for using BOK as a faster, more repeatable, and really richer way to assess burn severity. Another benefit of this approach is that the BOK has also been demonstrated as a fast, robust way to inventory fuels, ecological characteristics of forests. And this slide points to a presentation that our colleague Louise Loudermilk gave recently. She also gave a really good presentation at this meeting on Wednesday about some of this work that's incorporating laser scanning to drive fire behavior models, particularly quick fire, which is a spatially explicit fire behavior simulator that is physics-based, and it incorporates processes of fire to create realistic simulations of fire behavior and fire effects. And so these things all kind of fit together. And this is just a little plug for her work and some work that, actually a lot of work that we're doing together on that front. So, and I'd just like to quickly thank the team who really made this happen. Aaron Maxwell, WVU, did the machine learning. Also, Luis Andres Galen, who was at WVU, also did a lot of the machine learning work and image pre-processing. Lexi Everland was our technician when we started this project, and now is a fire manager with New Jersey Forest Fire Service. So congratulations to her. And then Nick and Louise are my colleagues in the Forest Service. Julia DeFeo helped with the field work. She's now a PhD student at Virginia Tech. She was a technician in the beginning. And Richard Stripmatter is at Stockton University. He was an intern who helped with this. And I also need to thank Trevor Rayner and John Erlin Jr., who were the fire managers who made the fire happen that we studied in this experiment, and are great colleagues to have in our local management agency. So with that, I am done.
Thank you so much, Mike. We do have a question for you from Huva, from Luis Gustavo Gonçalves. Mike, one of the fire severity markers in wetlands is penetration into organic soil. Can the tool also be calibrated to measure this?
Well, we haven't done that yet, but that's a good question. You know, if you can, you know, the laser basically only sees a depth change if you could really see a depth change. So if you're talking about like something like wetland peat being consumed, then yeah, this laser would be able to detect that, as long as there's nothing in the way of it. It's kind of like shining a flashlight in the dark. So if you're shining a flashlight in the woods in the dark, you only see as far until you hit something like a tree, and then there's a shadow behind it. So as long as the change isn't obscured, the laser should be able to see it.
Awesome, thank you. We have a couple more minutes for Mike to take a question or two. If anyone wants to come on their mic and ask, please do so.
Hi, Mike. Alex here again.
Hey, Alex.
Used some CBI with my talk I'm about to talk about, and so I'm interested in this technique. But correct me if I'm wrong, but you need to be able to take measurements pre-fire too, right? So that you can make that difference assessment.
No, so we looked at that. We did both. So you know, so CBI, right, is just a post-fire assessment, and then so we did compare just post-burn scans with difference pre and post burn results, and we didn't really find a huge difference. You know, basically one's a change and one is an estimate of change. So I think that you can, you know, just do post-burn scans as well.
Okay, great. That's important. Yeah.
But I would say that, you know, I mean, if you're working with CBI, like, you know, these different characteristics that we look at change from forest type to forest type. And so what might work in one landscape might not work as well in a different landscape. And like I said, the color attributes didn't work as well, but I was in a leaf off condition, potentially in a leaf on condition that could have a greater importance, especially with a single post burn scan.
Thank you so much, Mike. With that, we're going to move on to our next speaker. So thank you very much for your speech. And Alex Howe, if you want to get on screen, and Mike, if you want to stop sharing.
Yeah, give me a second here to. Right. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Take it away.
Okay. Great. Well, thanks everyone for joining today. My name's Alex. I'm a PhD student at Utah State University, and I'm going to be talking about Landsat and the relatively new Sentinel satellites and their utility for mapping burn severity in Western North America. So I imagine most of us here are familiar with the Landsat mission, of course, going back really since Landsat 4 through now our recently launched Landsat 9. Of course, MTBS program uses these satellites, and as was mentioned earlier, I've started to incorporate the Sentinel satellites, which is great. So just for a little background on the kind of timeline here, Sentinel, the first of the 2 Sentinel satellites that are in orbit right now, was launched in the summer of 2015, with second launched in the spring of 2017. The good news is that basically, if you're kind of a user of already, well derived and consistent data products like the MTBS suite for burn severity, the Sentinel, as of even just earlier this year, the USGS has released this harmonized Landsat Sentinel dataset, which its entire goal is basically to kind of provide a consistent processing steps for both streams of data. The mission of Sentinel, it's from the European Space Agency, was always meant to be synergistic with the Landsat mission. And so, as we go forward with these kind of products, they can be true kind of time series stacked and interchangeable. And of course, the huge advantage we gain from that is that we get higher revisit times. So on this graph, we can kind of see the median revisit time for any place on Earth was, as infrequent as 16 days when we only had Landsat 8. But has continually been dropping as we added the Sentinel satellites in. We're now down to something like about 3 to 5 days. And once we have Landsat 9 operational, we'll be down to pretty consistently 3. And as was mentioned earlier, of course, one of the main challenges is that cloud cover in a lot of regions. And so just having more revisit time is going to be a huge improvement as we move forward for just more consistently making, good paired matches of imagery for burn severity. But I want to also just so that's your only use case, then, you could stop listening here. But I think, Sentinel does have some additional advantages over Landsat that are worth considering. And the big one in my mind is that it has higher resolution that it can map at. So what we're looking at here are both Landsat 8, its different spectral bands, and Sentinel-2 up here. The main ones we oftentimes end up using for burn severity mapping are the near infrared and shortwave infrared. Those are a combination. So for Landsat, of course, we have our traditional 30-meter pixel size for both of those bands. With Sentinel, near infrared is mapped at 10 meters, shortwave infrared is mapped at 20 meters. So we're getting pixel sizes of 900 meters squared with Landsat. With Sentinel-2, we're not getting a true 100 meters. I kind of call it pseudo 100 meters because we can resample the shortwave infrared to 10 meters to blend it with near infrared. We're getting pixels that are, a ninth of the size and still getting that global coverage that we have available with Landsat. So what I'm really talking about here is trying to consider those resolution differences and how we can still take advantage of Sentinel in addition to Landsat and leverage those resolution differences. Probably pretty obvious to people who think about this, but of course, resolution matters. When we think about the process of fire on the landscape, we're talking about, a process that oftentimes has enough heterogeneity that occurs at the sub-pixel scale. There can be a lot of different effects going on. And when you think about it, oftentimes in our forests, our real kind of unit of interest is perhaps an individual tree. and we can have many trees within the scale of a 30-meter pixel. And of course, those effects end up being spectrally kind of averaged into one burn severity value. And what does that mean? Well, it can mean different things, but generally, as you start to change resolution, what the main effect seems to be is we're kind of moving. This is a distribution for a single fire of all the burn severity values. But what you're typically doing as you go to higher resolution is moving values out of the moderate range and basically kind of resolving those sub-pixel effects into maybe low severity effects and higher severity effects. And that could mean something like detecting kind of small refugium that are otherwise kind of getting masked out or kind of hidden within the more moderate resolution of Landsat. And also just, a clear difference when you're looking at ecotones within fires, the edge between, say, a grassland or meadow and, a forest stand here, those edges that overlap a whole pixel are just getting blended into considering a moderate severity. So Sentinel has had a number of studies since its launch in 2015 to kind of directly compare it to Landsat, both for burned area mapping and for burn severity mapping. But really the bulk of these studies have all been in the Southern Europe, India, Australia, and we haven't had any looks at this here in North America or South America for that matter to date. And again, another limitation of a lot of these studies has basically been that there mostly have been case studies of like single fires, and only a few of them have actually used ground validation to kind of assess the accuracy. So the general consensus from all this work so far has been that Sentinel is well suited to burn severity mapping and has similar accuracies to Landsat, but there's still that opportunity to actually formally look at that here in North America. So the basic objectives for this project I've been working on have been to compare the accuracy of burn severity maps derived from Sentinel-2 and Landsat 8, specifically for North American fires, but also using ground validated data. And then also just do the kind of an entry to exploring the basics of what that higher resolution that we can map with Sentinel and how that might impact some of our spatial assessments of burn severity within a fire. So the whole last talk was about composite burn index and CBI, which is why I was interested in that new method, because I'm very aware of some of CBI's limitations. It can be quite subjective, and it's kind of a, it's pyroforensics in a way, just trying to assess what happened on a plot. So there's a lot of subjectivity that's in there, but it is kind of our gold standard for doing these assessments. And so what I was able to do was get together all the CBI data I could get basically from 2016 to 2019. Again, the major limitation here being the first Sentinel was launched in 2015. And so we have CBI data from 26 fires here occurring across Western North America, Southwest, Upper Rockies, Cascades, even one fire that occurred just over the border in Canada. And all told across those, that's 912 total CBI plots. Just a quick reminder again, that was shown nicely in the last talk, but basically CBI is a measure that scales from 0 to 3, 0 being basically unchanged, 3 being the highest severity possible. And now it's important, with this project, I wanted to test a number of different ways to look at and calculate burn severity. And so kind of the traditional method that MTBS uses that's been used for a long time is this kind of paired scene approach, where you pick a single pre-fire and post-fire image over the fire footprint. And it requires an analyst, because you got to go through and you got to look for decently matched imagery for the phenology of those 2 years. And also obviously can be stymied by the fact that you might have a lot of clouded imagery. So I wanted to test that because that's obviously very commonly used, but I also wanted to test a more relatively newly used approach, which is this compositing imagery approach that Sean Parks et al. In 2018 proposed. And he's on this project as well. And basically what this approach does is for both the pre-fire and the post-fire is able to use a time series stack. So you can define the date range for that imagery. Pixels come with quality flags. And so individual pixels from a given scene that have cloud cover or cloud shadows can be masked out and basically thrown out. And then the remaining pixel stack can be then computed into a single composite image with some sort of compositing statistic like mean or median of those values. And in the end, you come up with a single pre and post fire image. So from that point on, the process is basically the same. But of course, it allows for more automation and not having to go that, specifically selecting those scenes pre and post. So with that in mind, for both Landsat and Sentinel imagery, for the paired scene and the imagery compositing, these two approaches to mapping burn severity, I tested a number of different indices, all the common NBR, normalized burn ratio related indices, as well as a difference in DVI and a relativized version of that, basically because I was also curious about, Sentinel actually can map NDVI at true 10-meter resolution because the red band is also 10 meters. We also tested a phenological offset, which is commonly done by MTBS, and the Parks et al. Paper back in 2018 also came up with an automated way to do this by calculating an average pre-value and post-value for NVR from like 180-meter band just outside of the fire. So also wanted to apply that and test it. And then unique to the paired scene, there's some imagery processing stuff, pre-processing. Unique to the imagery compositing version, there's some imagery season selection things to think about. As you might imagine, how you pick those date ranges can be important. And then, as I referenced earlier, how you compute that composite statistic could matter as well. So I wanted to test all these things. So just a little bit more detail on these two parts because they're a little less obvious. With a paired scene approach, I picked the dates used by the MTBS program. 24 out of the 26 fires had been mapped by MTBS. We didn't actually use the MTBS data products directly because they have don't calculate all the indices we wanted to look at. But we use those for the Landsat products. We tried then our best to match those dates for the Sentinel project products or scenes. But a caveat is that Sentinel has a level 1C top of atmosphere, unatmospherically corrected version, and a bottom of atmosphere version as well. And so we wanted to basically see what the difference was there. So we used an R package, Sentinel-2 to basically post-process. And the problem is that in Earth Engine, they didn't start doing these processing globally until the fall of 2018. So we were only able to look at the level 1C product with a composite approach with a level 1C product. So fairly simple for the imagery compositing. The seasons that we picked, we call one the extended composite. That simply uses a static date range, June 1st through September 30th for the year before fire, same dates for the year after fire. But we also wanted to try this relatively new approach that was just published earlier this year called a hybrid composite, which basically uses a static date range from before the fire for the imagery season, but then uses a dynamic range from after the fire that basically uses MODIS imagery to estimate the day that the fire ends, and then runs the imagery season through November 30th, and then combines that with imagery from the year after the fire starting, again, estimated from a MODIS snow cover product the day after the majority snow cover melts through July 1st. And test that in the lower 48 because that was designed specifically with boreal forest in mind. Also applied a forest mask. This was really focused on, CBI, how you interpret it in forest versus shrub or grassland can be quite different. And so we applied this forest mask. As you can see, it does a pretty good job of masking out non-forest areas with fire. So we could just really focus on those forested regions. Okay, so that was a lot of kind of factorial design of different things we were testing. So we looked at initially just differences in some of these types. The compositing type, mean versus median, made virtually no difference. So we got rid of the median and just kept the mean. With the phenological offset, interestingly, made the performance worse when we applied it in both cases for Landsat 8 and Sentinel-2. So we basically just kept a simpler non-offset version. And then all those severity indices, we basically looked at their relative strength. The DNDVI clearly performed the worst in both cases, and the RDNDVI improved it slightly. So we basically just tossed out the DNDVI version from further analysis. And then these compositing methods, I didn't even touch on this kind of peak NDVI method that I was testing out in addition, but it didn't perform any better really. So we basically just kept the hybrid and extended versions. So two actual results. This is obviously a lot of plots that are kind of overwhelming. We're comparing Landsat 8 and Sentinel-2 here on both sides for the different indices here on the y-axis. This is the extended composite, and this is the hybrid composite. That's too much to really take in all at once, but the basic initial point is simply that the general accuracies between the two are pretty similar, which is to be expected from previous work. So that wasn't too surprising, but to get into the nuances of some of those differences just a little bit more, for the compositing approach here, we can kind of, this highlights it a little bit better. So this is the extended imagery season. These are the R-squared fit values of those CVI data to the spectral indices. And this is the paired scene as well. First of all, just highlighting this extended imagery season, Sentinel-2, at least for all the NVR related indices, outperformed Landsat 8, not by huge amounts, but noticeable amounts. RD and DVI was the one exception to that. But when we look at the hybrid imagery season, interestingly, that improved all the fits for Landsat, but it actually decreased them for Sentinel. I think that might have something to do with the number of images. Sentinel has more images available, and so that hybrid approach may be pulling more imagery from the kind of shoulder, fall, and spring seasons that might be pulling those averages for the composite and decreasing that accuracy. But when we look at the paired scene, interestingly, both Landsat 8 and Sentinel-2, when you look at just the top of atmosphere for Sentinel-2, the unatmospherically corrected version of the product versus the surface, the atmospherically corrected product for Landsat 8, performed pretty similar. But the clear winner here was the atmospherically corrected Sentinel-2 product, the level 2A product, and that outperformed and increased the accuracy. So the real takeaway from that is that when you combine the fact that as we start to go forward with the compositing approach and Earth Engine and other methods where this is consistently computed across globally with this atmospherically corrected product, and you combine that with potentially a compositing approach, we're likely to see even better accuracies. Okay, and then just to go back quickly to the idea of the resolution differences, I did a quick analysis, and so you can kind of see again that distribution I was talking about. This is a single fire. But when you move from 30-meter resolution to 10-meter resolution, again, you can see that clear trend. What really is happening is we're moving a number of those values that we're predicting into moderate range and basically kind of resolving them into areas of low and high that seem to be happening at the sub-pixel level. And that overall effect across all our 26 fires here, not very much when you think about it. The average difference was basically losing about a percentage when you between the 10 and 30. And resolving that to low and high. But if you take a look at that across the area of all these fires, what you're really doing is you are moving a fairly substantial amount. So that over 2,400 hectares across these fires is changing from being mapped at moderate severity to low and high. And finally here, just to kind of show a number of we typically oftentimes look at these burn severity products as categorical, and there's a number of landscape metrics that we oftentimes use to kind of categorize those spatial patterns of fires. And so what I looked at here was this idea of high severity patch interior, or basically areas of high severity that are greater than 90 meters from the closest pixel that wasn't mapped at high severity. These are increasingly important as more studies show that post-fire regeneration is highly tied to distance from the closest surviving seed source for a lot of different conifers. And so what we can see here is kind of a general trend is that Sentinel at 10 meters here in the turquoise is mapping both more high severity within a fire, as I showed on the last slide, but it's showing up less percent high severity patch interior than Landsat 8 or Sentinel-2 when you resample it to 30 meters. So I'm not saying that we're necessarily picking up non-high severity subpixels that are truly seed sources per se. That's beyond the scope of this study, but I think it deserves closer attention. It might mean we're overestimating some of those estimates of those high severity patches. So to quickly summarize the key points again, Sentinel-2 and Landsat basically map burn severity with similar accuracies. So as they get integrated, it's only going to be a net positive because we're going to just have more scenes to choose from, and that's going to result in hopefully higher quality burn severity maps. But the bottom of atmosphere Sentinel imagery outperformed Landsat with a paired scene approach, and the top of atmosphere Sentinel imagery did just as well or better than Landsat with a composite approach. So as we combine that bottom of atmosphere imagery with the composite approach, we might even see further gains. The hybrid approach improved Landsat accuracy, but it decreased it for Sentinel. So I think that is potentially interesting because it means we might be able to apply that compositing approach and move it not just for the boreal, but also for the lower 48 or other regions as well. And then finally, just Sentinel's higher resolution offers clear potential, and I think it deserves further exploration. I think it'd be great to start to pair that with studies with even higher resolution data like LiDAR. but it also requires caution with comparisons to the coarser like Landsat resolution if you're considering that. And with that, I'd just like to say thank you very much to all the people who contributed CBI data to this project. It wouldn't have been possible without everyone else and the rest of my lab at USU. And I know I'm very close to time, but if I have any time for questions, love to take them.
We do have one question. I think we have some time if you can answer it as quickly.
Yeah.
A great study. Have you dug in a bit more on differences between these various options in open versus dense canopy conditions?
No, that's kind of been beyond the scope of this. It was really kind of, the purpose was to do a big study on as many fires as possible and over a heterogeneous area of different forest types and just kind of look at that overall accuracy assessments. And so I think that it would be great next steps to really kind of dig into what Sentinel is possible and what you can do with it across different, different canopy types. And that's where I think combining even higher resolution data would be a really cool next step.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Alex. Appreciate you. And we're going to get on to our next speaker, Don Falk. So Don, if you want to come on screen, get your presentation started. Thanks for being here.
Okay, you can see this all right?
Yes, I can.
Great. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for the really great presentations in this session. My relationship to this kind of information is a little different from what we've seen up until this point, and that in the sense that we're asking what an end user could derive from some of these data and not so much how they're generated. And needless to say, the work that you all are doing would greatly inform the accuracy of what we can obtain for this. And in particular, we're interested in what we can learn about combining severity data from areas that have reburned, and that's going to be the focus here. So we're essentially asking, what can an end user derive from severity data to make an ecological inference about reburned areas? So everybody, I think, realizes increasingly that reburns represent a really substantial problem. On the other hand, it's worth stepping back and reminding ourselves that on first principles, many areas were probably experiencing reburns under the natural historical fire regime. If we think about the established fire return interval, that would imply pretty frequent reburning, although presumably at a very different severity from what's being exposed now. So the question of reburn is not necessarily the problem, it's the combination of reburn and severity. And of course, as area burn is increasing, this means that almost by necessity, the probability is increasing that areas will experience multiple fire exposures over time. So this has kind of gone from a somewhat marginal problem, kind of off on the side, to I think what will be pretty clearly a central issue for fire science and for fire management, and especially for the understanding both fire behavior and fire ecology of reburned areas. They're no longer a side issue. It's going to become a central issue if it's not already. Unfortunately, the ecological recovery of especially high severity reburns is very poorly understood. And as in so often the case, in understanding the ecological effects, things get very noisy very quickly. For example, just collapsing a categorical high or moderate severity may obscure a lot of the details of how things actually burn. In general, we have an understanding that following high severity and widespread mortality, we would expect either some persistence and then some seedling colonization or resprouting in leading to a paradigm in which post-fire succession would lead back to the pre-disturbance state, either recovery or a transient reorganization. But of course, we're seeing a lot of increasingly novel or unexpected trajectories, biome conversion, major community type conversion. So the ecological side of reburns, as well as the fire behavior side, is really becoming quite consequential, both from the point of view of understanding future ecology and for land managers. So we're trying to build more of a framework then for understanding the ecological progression of areas following a reburn. And just to illustrate this, this is a map for a fire that I'm sure many of you are very familiar with, the Dixie Fire from this year. And just to point out here that in this fairly large fire, there are very substantial areas that have reburned 2 and even 3 times. The 4 and 5 reburn areas are small, but the 2 or 3 reburn areas are really quite substantial. And of course, here we're not looking at the severity of the individual reburns, but just the overlapping perimeters. So this has suggested that we need better tools to assess reburns at landscape scales and then drilling down to fine scales. And I want to say I really appreciated Alex's comments on the benefits of improved spatial resolution, which could really help in this respect. So what would we need to make this assessment? Well, first of all, we need an assessment of the severity of each event. And we've seen already this morning the wide variety of products that we have available to do that. Secondly, time since fire must factor in some way to this consideration, because it represents either in a null model recovery time, that is recovery back to the pre-fire state, but increasingly it could also represent a fuel accumulation period and a time for a system to go off into an alternative trajectory. For example, a post-fire aspen stand, or in the Southwest, Gamble Oak or Locust, may look very different after 5 years, but 20, 30 years in, it may start to be angling back to its original state. So time since fire is complex. It's not always recovery. It could be locking in an alternative state. Clearly, we've got to adjust for the ecological community type at the time of the fire. For example, here in the Southwest, high elevation conifer stands have a very slow recovery following post-fire, following high severity fire, compared to mid-elevation oak woodlands, which can bounce back incredibly quickly. And so we'd have to be thinking about the post-fire recovery differently for those. And then lastly, the climate during the recovery period, especially where there are obligate cedars involved. So to construct an index that would capture this, we'd begin with a severity layer for each fire event. And so and as far as we have determined up to this point, any of the indices would work. The important thing here would just be to use a consistent index across the comparisons, but this is an area of exploration. So for a given pixel, you would then want to discount that severity by the time since fire. So here we're putting that simply in the denominator. So as time since fire increases, it's essentially going to discount that experienced severity. And so now next we would add these time corrected severities for each fire that has been experienced at that IJ pixel. So you can see severity in the first fire divided by the time since fire plus the severity of the second fire divided by that time, which would be different, and so on up to a series of F fires. And this essentially is the core of what would become a fire exposure recovery index, which we could state more parsimoniously this way. This is calculated at a pixel scale and then would be expanded to a landscape view. It's worth noting, just in this original null model, which is our starting point, that putting time in the denominator gives us a rectangular hyperbola, basically a rectangular hyperbolic decay of that effect, or recovery, if you will. And whether this is the best mathematical approximation of ecological recovery, or whether it should be an exponential decay or some other mathematical function, I think is also open for exploration. The hyperbolic model seems like a good starting point, but we'd certainly want to move on from there. So how does this work out? What does this look like, and what does it show us? So I'll show you two examples that we've explored here in the Sky Islands in the Southwest, the Sky Islands being a region of montane islands, as you can see in the map, between the Rocky Mountain Massif and the Sierra Madre, which are primarily in Mexico. The Sky Islands have a property that, if you haven't seen them, are quite remarkable, extending from Sonoran Desert all the way up into mixed conifer, subalpine forest in fairly short distances. So we have very steep ecological gradients and very compact ecosystems. In most of the Sky Islands, we also have a bimodal rainfall pattern, winter storms coming in from the Pacific and then the summer monsoon in roughly equal proportions depending where you are. So the Santa Catalina Mountains, which are the range that you see outlined here, have experienced three major recent fires since 2002, the Bullock, Aspen, and Bighorn fire. Fascinating to note that the Bullock and Aspen fire, their combined burn total with very little overlap was about 115,000 acres, very similar to what the Bighorn fire burned in 119,000 acres just last year. There have been other smaller fires before and since, but these certainly cover the vast majority of area. So when we go out in the field and look at these combinations of classified fire severity with the two initials here indicating the first, we combined the Bullock and Aspen since they were in successive years. And so for our purpose here, we're just treating them as a single event for that time since fire. And then the second letter here being the severity in the Bighorn fire. And so you can see a wide range of outcomes from systems that all started out in pretty much the same vegetation type, depending on the combination of the severities. So this, of course, is something that we'd want to understand, and we'd want to unpack this a little bit because clearly there's a lot more going on than we can see just with these classifications. So the question is then, what do we see? Do we understand the current situation better when we add the legacy using the Fire Exposure Recovery Index or some similar product to just looking at the most recent fire? So here's an example of the RBR, Parks et al. 2014, for the Bighorn fire, the fire that burned last year. The black points are our study plot locations. And here's the RBR for the Bullock and Aspen fire, 2002 and 2003. So you can notice that the Bighorn burned into some areas that were not touched by the Bullock and Aspen. The same is also true along the southern edge. There's some areas that burned in one fire but not the other. So what happens then when we compute and express the FERI on a landscape scale, and this is what it looks like. So here you'll notice that a lot of the areas that burned in both fires at moderate to high severity are still showing a very high cumulative impact, reflecting that legacy of the earlier fire. Whereas some of the areas that were burning for the first time in the Bighorn or that burned at low severity in the Aspen and Bullock seem to be on a recovery pathway. And our plot sampling seems to confer those, so that's work in progress. So let's just zoom into a few of these areas just as an example. So in the upper left is an area that burned in relatively high severity in Bullock Aspen and kind of mixed patchiness, but some areas of fairly low severity in Bighorn. And you can see that the result then is that legacy effect of Bullock and Aspen from the higher severity fires is starting to disappear. 18 years out, a lot of those areas are recovering with some patchy areas, whereas the areas that were high in both fires still remain a significant, retain a significant effect from both events. Here's a contrasting example where of an area of fairly contiguous high severity, and then again superimposing on that high severity in Bighorn, and the index indicates that this is still, we would predict a still significantly high severity expressed on the landscape. And in contrast, areas that had a kind of patchy mosaic in both fires, the index seems to capture that. You get a different spatial pattern in the FERI from what you get from just the Bighorn, indicating again that some of those areas that were already pretty well recovered. So the main thing this tells us here is that we're seeing different information. We're seeing a different landscape interpretation of the ecological legacy from the earlier fires. Let's take another example, again from the Sky Islands. This one is drawn from the Pinaleño Mountains, which are the tallest of the Sky Islands, over 3,000 meters, and get a little higher up into the subalpine zone. The Pinaleño Mountains are a very interesting story from the point of view of land use and ecology. It has multiple astronomical installations, including one that's operated by the Vatican, affectionately known as the Pope Scope. The mountains are the home to the listed Mount Graham red squirrel, and it is also a sacred mountain to the Apache people. And so it's a convergence of many factors, not all of which necessarily get along with each other. And in particular, having squirrels and telescopes on a mountain that's having large fires has caused a lot of heartburn for many people. 3 major fires here again: Clark Peak in 1996, Nuttall Gibson in 2004, for a combined area over a somewhat larger time than we saw in those consecutive fires in the Catalinas of 30,000 acres. And then once again, the 2017 Fry Fire, burning pretty much to the combined total of those two. And this has got me wondering if this is a phenomenon we're seeing with some of these larger fires superimposing on reburn areas, if they're burning that cumulative total. So here's the classified fire severity from the 2017 Fry Fire. And I'm also showing you, just for reference, the plot network established by Kid O'Connor when he was here at University of Arizona. Multiple papers have used these plots, and we continue to read these. The Fry Fire overall maps out as, by and large, relatively low severity, except for the one patch in a high elevation area called Webb Peak, which you can see here. And when we map the Ferry Index, in fact, that area really stands out because it has been burned several times, most recently in the Fry Fire, but it's had fire exposure. But we can also see some very interesting differences. The areas of low severity and Fry, just toggling back and forth between these, you can see that that legacy effect from the earlier fires is really significant. There are areas that had high severity impact that would still be in recovery that you would miss if you were only looking at the severity from the most recent fire. So again, this suggests that including the legacy effect of the earlier fires in some computed products, such as the Fire Exposure and Recovery Index, could tell us a lot about areas that could be of ecological significance and also management importance. Moving forward, a few options possibly to improve the ferry beyond this NOAA model. First of all, it's interesting to wonder whether the interactions among successive fires would be additive, which is what I've shown, or multiplicative in this form. There are a lot of multiplicative interactions in ecology, and we're trying it both ways. And of course, you can compute the index, and then you need field data to validate that and establish which form of the index is giving us the greatest predictive value, because after all, of course, this is all ultimately would be about the predictive skill of this index. Second, you'd want to add a term correcting for the characteristic recovery rates by ecosystem types, as I alluded to earlier. You'd probably do this by modifying the time since fire term so that a faster recovering ecosystem type, such as a woodland, would have a different denominator from a conifer forest. And then you'd want to superimpose on this a time varying term for climate, and we're still working on how to do that, which clearly would affect the recovery rate. So I want to say at this point that we're really interested in people's ideas about other ways we might be able to improve this index.
2 minutes.
Whether the additive or multiplicative form would make more sense. The benefits, of course, doing this at different spatial resolutions. The important question of which of the primary severity index products would be the most predictive for capturing these processes. I want to thank our fabulous field crew who just did a ton of work in helping us to put some ecological reality under the work that we're doing. And many people contributed to this presentation. We're especially grateful to the folks at GTAC who helped with the severity layers, to Emmett Williams, who's now at U.S. Forest Service Lake Tahoe, who did the work in the Pinaleños, and many other colleagues who have helped out with this work. So thanks very much, and I'd really enjoy your questions.
Thank you so much, Don. We have time for one question, probably, if someone wants to come on their microphone. You can type it into the chat or the Q&A in Whova.
And I'll just prompt that by saying we're interested in other ways people have approached this question. That is how to capture the predictive skill of remote sensing severity products to predict the legacy of reburns.
All right, well, it looks like we don't have any questions at this time. So once again, always feel free and follow up with Don through Whova or any other channel that that he's given you in his presentation. But at this point in time, we're going to bring up our next speaker. Thanks again, Don.
Thanks, everybody.
And let me introduce Alicia Reiner. Ali?
Hi, let me share my screen here. Do you see the screen?
Yes, looks great.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I'm Alicia Reiner. I'm a fire ecologist with the USDA Forest Service Enterprise Program. And I'm here to talk with you about some regionally specific models that we built for the Southwestern United States, which dovetails into Don's talk. And these models will predict burn severity, basal area change, and canopy cover change. And before I get too far, I'd like to thank my co-authors and collaborators here, Craig Baker from GTAC, and Craig Baker developed the image pairs and index products. Max developed the photo interpretation angle of the project. And Ben and Joe helped me to bounce around analysis ideas and help me deal with my horrible manuscript writing. So Don did a great, and others have done great explanations of why we would bother to model and monitor burn severity. This data is continually more useful in informing how we're managing our land and how it gives us an angle at which to evaluate our fuels and fire management strategies. And also we're priming other models and factors that give us ideas of how fuels change, carbon changes, soils, wildlife habitat, all of that, how that changes with fire. We had some great information about the MTBS monitoring trends in burn severity system, so I won't go through this in depth, but MTBS is an all lands approach, regardless of ownership or veg type, going back to 1984, and in which there's some typical standard thresholds that an analyst might help define between the severity categories. The remote assessment of vegetation condition after fire, the Ravage program, pulled together by GTAC. That's mainly on Forest Service lands and on forested or woodland lands with 10% or greater canopy cover. That data set doesn't go back as far as MTBS, so it's a smaller spatial and temporal area for that data set. The products are, in addition to burn severity, include canopy cover change and basal area change. And instead of an analyst or standard breakpoints between DMBR choosing the low, high, and et cetera categories, the product is based on models. So the current Ravage models that are applied in general come from the 2007 and 09 papers by Miller and Thode, which were built on a data set that's mainly Sierra Nevada, Klamath Mountain, California based with some Oregon in there. There's, and you can imagine applying those to the Western United States has some drawbacks. So there's been some motivation within the Ravage program to get some more regionally specific models developed. I'm going to point out that Brian Harvey and Saba Sabiri, who might be in the audience right now, developed some models for the Northwest that are interior Northwest that are regionally specific. And my co-authors and field workers and I worked on these, developing this product for the Southwestern United States. So a quick review of the severity indices we're dealing with if you just came into the session here. The normalized burn ratio, or NBR, is the difference between the near infrared and shortwave infrared divided by the sum. The near infrared being the champion of finding green vegetation and chlorophyll type things, and the shortwave being the champion of finding black things, soil, ash, char. And so when you take the pre-fire NBR and subtract the post-fire, you get the delta NBR, which is good at telling us what happened as far as burn severity. In about 2007, Miller and Thode came up with a relativized version of this index that relativized it by the pre-fire NBR, which has the advantage of allowing DNBR, the small differences in that, to be captured better in cases where pre-fire NBR is low. And so somebody asked a canopy cover question, and so that's your low canopy cover areas. And then in 2014, Parks et al. Came up with the relative burn ratio, if I said that right. And that's an improvement on the mathematical drawbacks of the RDNBR, with having the absolute value and the NBR in the denominator. And that helps out in situations where you have negative or very low NBR, like the Southwest. For data acquisition, we gathered three main types of data. So we took the standard field training data with boots on the ground. And then we gathered photo interpretation data also, where we got pre and post-fire aerial resource photography images where that was available. And then we got our geospatial data, the golden child of which was the severity indices. Those were calculated as image pairs from Craig Baker helped and did those. We looked at initial assessment and extended assessment with that imagery in those indices. So for folks coming in the initial assessment, the IA timeframe, that's referring to weeks after fire, whereas the extended assessment, or EA, is referring to one growing season after fire, essentially a year after fire. And our study, like a lot of burn severity studies, we chose to collect our field data in the EA timeframe because it's just a lot more logistically feasible. The fires we sampled were in Arizona and New Mexico. We gathered data from 21 fires, 300 and some odd plots. And for the photo interpretation data, we were able to find useful times of and quality of aerial photos for 6 of those fires that we field sampled. And we also tacked on 2 additional fires for the PI data. With the PI data, we oversampled 50 PI plots onto, we co-located them with the field plots to have a subsample where we could use to compare apples to apples the methods between photo interp and the field data. That's not going to fit in 15 minutes. So if you have questions about that, you can ask or contact me afterwards. I loved all the photos Don had of the Southwest. This is just a sample of our field plots here. In Arizona and New Mexico, you can find anything from pinyon juniper woodlands in the low elevation to dry ponderosa pine stands to mixed conifer, and then some dense music forests in the upper elevations. The burn severity field data we gathered was composite burn index, which has been mentioned in this session as well. This form on the right is from Key and Benson 2006. It's the last page of that GTR. And the composite word of composite burn index means you're averaging together these 5 strata. So the substrates, herbs and low shrubs, tall shrubs, intermediate trees, and then big trees. And then within those 5 strata, the field observer assigns a 0 to 1, 0 to 3 qualitative score based on these 5 questions about how much stuff is consumed or how much the tree is scorched or torched. We gathered this data in 30-meter diameter plots. For the tree data we took to arrive at stand metrics, we gathered data on trees greater than 10 centimeters. We used the forest vegetation simulator to do the post-processing to get canopy cover and basal area. For the photo interpretation data, that data set is only giving us canopy cover data. We stratified those plots on RDNBR to get a decent sample. And within each of those PI plots, we laid out a subsampling grid, and a PI technician would assign cover yes or no to each of those plots, those subsamples, and then average to arrive at a canopy cover. So for data structure, this is just a little exploratory look at what our data looks like. On the x-axis, you can see we have the DNBR, and on the y-axis are our 3 different response variables we're looking at. There's a heavy distribution at a heavy mass of data at 0 and at 1, and then there's some continuous data in between. And this type of distribution, we found, thank you to Harvey and Severity, that the 0 and 1 inflated beta distribution by Ospina and Ferrari works with this well. And we landed on the gamless package in R because it can assign a lot of different distributions to work with your data, the Zoid data being one of those. Let's see, so model development. As I said, we have 3 response variables we were looking at. So we were developing models ×3. So all this work is ×3. There were a number of different indices and factors, model forms that we wanted to look at. So if we had looked at all possible permutations, it would have been a bit much, and we could have come up with some spurious results. So we chose to do the machine learning kind of thing where you look at things in a series of levels, and you could either kick out the worst one, or we chose to take the best one on to the next level and kick everybody else off the island. So our first round of model development, we looked at model form, we looked at parametric model forms, those that are used in the current Ravage models. They involve a sine curve, a natural log curve. We looked at general additive models, GAMs, and I threw in a random forest last minute just for giggles. We looked at indices and sensors. So Craig Baker calculated all 3 indices for both Landsat and Sentinel. And then we evaluated the offset, which is the phenological offset, which is the average DNBR in a homogeneous area outside the burn that's used to offset the phenology differences between pre and post images. And we also evaluated simple and multivariate models because we thought and knew going into this that the lower canopy cover, I mean, you can imagine this lower canopy cover in the Southwest means that an eye in the sky, like a satellite index, isn't going to be as strong of a tool. So we thought we might need to boost that with some topographic variables. So quickly through the results, I'm showing you test MSE averaged across 7-fold cross-validation. The simple GAM worked sort of the best for most of the predictors. There was one case where the parametric model worked or the multivariate GAM worked, but to move one model form forward, we went with the GAM that was simple. For the indices and sensors, the DNBR derived from Sentinel worked the best for the initial assessment, and the RBR derived from the Sentinel worked the best for the extended assessment. And this was true miraculously for all 3 response variables. So that was easy. The offset in general was a helpful addition to the model. So we chose to use all the indices calculated with the offset. And then when we evaluated the simple versus multivariate GAM, we actually found that the simple GAM was, not drastically different, but usually had the lower test MSE. So we went forward with the simple GAM to develop our final models. And so the final models on the left, we have the Southwest, well, I don't know if I should recap, but we landed on all the factors that I just showed you in the previous slides. And the Southwest models are on the left here, and the current models applied to our data set are on the right. On the top, we have the IA time series, and on the bottom, we have the EA time series. So for severity, the answer was fairly simple, that the models created with the Southwest data were the best. The answer is different for, it's kind of a mixed answer for change in basal area and change in canopy cover. Before I jump into this, I didn't mention that the accuracy in kappa, so test MSE is a test metric that describes how far your prediction is from your actual data. Whereas the accuracy in kappa are telling you how many pixels you classify into the correct classification bins. So for change in basal area and change in canopy cover, the test MSE was lower and better for the Southwest models. For the current models, they actually predicted more pixels into the correct categories. Another way to look at this is with the confusion matrices. So this, we have gobs of these. So this is a sample from the IA time series. This is change in basal area. Southwest models on the left and current models on the right. If you had a perfect model, all of your data would fall into these black cells here on the diagonal. You can see with the ravage models, we have some in there, but there's also some outside. They're not too far outside, and there's not too many in these far gross error bins on the diagonal this way. For the current models, they really stick the landing on the lowest bin and the highest bin, but there's a smattering of gross errors here on the edges. So in conclusion, for severity modeling, just go with the Southwest ravage models. For change in basal area and change in canopy cover, it depends. If you're looking for a continuous response, you might want to go with the Southwest ravage, but it would have very few very wrong categorical predictions. But if you want the categorical predictions with the most correct answers, go with the current model. And with that, I can take any questions.
Thank you, Ali. I don't see any questions in Whova quite yet, but if anyone has one, please feel free. You can turn on your microphone if you'd like and verbally ask it.
If there's no questions, I can add that, I mean, I was looking at why for the IA time series DNBR functioned better and why for the EA time series the extended RBR functioned better. And my guess at that is that it did so because DNBR is correlated with pre-fire canopy cover. And so immediately post-fire, I think the upper elevations with the music forest that tend to be stand replacing, just having those completely new plots there, I think that gave us enough of a nudge to have that correlation to pre-fire NBR help out and push DNBR into being the winner versus in the EA timeframe. It makes sense that a relativized version of the index that's normalized by pre-fire NBR might help, because in the EA timeframe, there's a little bit more regrowth and the signature is a little bit more muddied. And so I think having those differences normalized by pre-fire NBR helps.
Hey, Ali, this is Don Falk. Thanks for that presentation. It was really great. I don't think you said this. I apologize if you did, but did you see any differences in the skill among forest types, as you alluded to?
Ooh, that's a good question. I could chunk it out and look at that someday. We looked at using Landfire BPS code as a predictor, and it almost made it into feature selection. But elevation, slope, and a topographic wetness index were the winners in feature selection for the multivariate models. But,
so the vegetation type would be implicit in that, presumably.
Presumably.
Yeah.
Yes. So maybe that's your answer.
I don't know. Yeah, it just because of the recovery pathways are so different. Anyway, really great work. Really look forward to following this.
Yeah, and thank you for your presentation. I think you were asking for ideas, and I think some of those topographic variables might help you.
Thank you so much. I'm actually going to end it here simply because we do have a closing session starting in just 1 minute. So I wanted to just thank all of our speakers today for sharing your expertise and experience with us. And this session will be available in Whova, our conference app, within 2 weeks after the Congress ends. Be sure to join us at our closing plenary session starting right now. And this session will feature our AFI Special Award announcements and keynote speaker, Paulo Fernandez, Associate Professor at the University of Trás-os-Montes, and Lenya Quinn Davidson, Area Fire Advisor for the University of California Cooperative Extension. To get to that session, you just want to use the agenda tab and click on sessions and click the main session title to join. Thanks again to all of our speakers and have a great rest of your day. Thanks so much.